Okay, everyone. So we are on the downhill slope to the end of the semester. So if you have not taken a look at the final exam materials, please do so as soon as possible. The format for the final essay is exactly like the midterm. It just has different readings. So, but you'll want to get on top of finding sources and so on. So make sure that you do so. So I'm going to recap last week's readings. So here we go. The first reading from last week was Joseph Conrad's The Secret Sharer. And I actually like this work so much that I teach it in other classes. So I think this is one of Conrad's best works, and what's nice about it is it's short, so you can teach it relatively easily without overburdening a student with a lot of reading. So Conrad was well known for working on boats. That's how we got works such as Heart of Darkness. And also Lord Jim. So The Secret Sharer is focused on sailing and so on. So we have two characters that are really of interest. The captain, whose name that we never learn, and Legat, who is his doppelganger. And a doppelganger is like a twin, but they're not related to you in any way. So you look alike, you sound alike, and so on. But the only connection between you is basically that appearance and sound and so on. There's no blood relationship. Although often in literature and mythology, doppelgangers have some sort of spiritual connection. And there are even interpretations that suggest that when a doppelganger shows up in your life, it's because they're there to steal your life from you. So not your life in the sense of they're going to take your life force and you're going to die, but they're going to take over your life. They're going to replace you. So there's a lot of interpretation about how The Secret Sharer, the captain is the main character, reflects how Conrad felt as, an early captain, or, working on these ships, and he didn't have a lot of experience. And so this was sort of a reflection of his doubt and so on in that. But I always make the argument that either Legat really is a doppelganger, or he could be just a delusion of a weak and inexperienced captain. And so I have a couple of points that you can think about and make a decision for yourself whether you believe Legat's a doppelganger or not. My first one is that when the skipper of the Sephora, the ship that Legat claims that he used to be on, where he killed someone, and then that's why he jumped into the water, the skipper of the Sephora did not immediately think that the captain was the murderer that he was after. And if he had, there certainly would have been a lot of uproar, not only from anyone who would have been from Sephora, but also from the captain's ship. How could you accuse our captain of murder and when he was clearly with us, and so on. My second point, how did the layout of the captain's quarters allow for Legat to hide? So Conrad goes through the ringer basically to describe the strange layout of the captain's quarters. Essentially, they are an L shape, but instead of being an L where the long part of the L is up and down, and the short part is side to side. It's the other way around. So the long part of the L is side to side, and the short part is up and down. So Legat was taking advantage of this weird shape of this room to hide from the other members of the crew. So he would go back into that short L part and either hide in the bathroom, or he would hide amongst the captain's clothes and escape detection. But there is one very notable occasion where one of the crew comes in and literally walks all throughout the captain's quarters and leaves without seeing Legat at all. And so that makes me wonder, you know, even, and at that time, I believe he was hiding in the wardrobe or something like that. Even if he had managed to hide himself, which is the reasonable answer? Is the reasonable answer doppelganger, or is the reasonable answer delusion? And finally, looking at Legat's rescue and return to sea. So the captain is walking the deck by himself when Legat is rescued. The captain happens to look over the side of the ship and see Legat and rescues him, helps him up onto the ship, and then proceeds to hide him in his quarters. And then when Legat returns to the sea, they've reached this particular location. The captain manages to get Legat, across the deck and over the side, again without detection. So I always raise the question when teaching this work: is Legat the doppelganger, or is he the delusion? And you could also make the argument, does it really matter? If it's a delusion or a doppelganger, does Legat serve a purpose for the captain that nothing else could? Again, after Legat goes over the side at the end and returns to the water, the captain is no longer the weak captain that he was at the beginning. So there you go. Okay. The next, there were several poems by Yeats. So William Butler Yeats, his last name looks like Yeats, but is pronounced Yates. And he is Irish, was born near Dublin. And so some of his poems have to do with events that occurred within Ireland that maybe wouldn't have any real historical notice, except for the fact that he's a famous poet and he wrote about it. So his first poem, Easter 1916, is about a rebellion that occurred on Easter by Irish nationalists. So Irish nationalists, these are people of Ireland who want Ireland to be its own country. And this was occurring while World War I was still going on. So the cause essentially for this rebellion was that England had promised more autonomy to Ireland, but because of World War I, never instituted it. They actually made the promise right in the same year that World War I started in 1914. And then they never gave the Irish what they wanted and said, well, it's World War, this great war is happening, so we're going to put it off until the war is over. The Irish Rebellion was notable, particularly, of course, to the Irish, but ultimately unsuccessful. I mean, a rebellion of the Irish against a giant British empire is not going to be successful. So a lot of the leaders of that uprising wound up being executed. So the real thing to note about Easter 1916 as a poem is the beautiful language that Yeats uses to describe his own people and the people who want to make a sacrifice for Ireland. So in the very last stanza, it says, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice that heaven's part, our part, to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last is come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pearse, now in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born." So in poetry, Yeats is honoring those that rebelled and died against England. And that maybe England will keep its faith when all is said and done, but we know England's dreams enough to know that they have dreamed and are dead, just as our people have dreamed and are dead. So this is a very beautiful and immaculately worded poem about having pride for one's nationality. The second poem I gave you to read by Yeats is called The Second Coming, and this is actually my favorite Yeats poem. So it is describing the opposite of the second coming that is foretold in the Bible. So he describes a world that is spinning out of control, where what is expected, such as the falcon hearing the falconer, is falling apart. And I think that the most moving lines in this poem are, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." So if you think about that, again, remember that for Yeats, what happens to Ireland is never far from his mind. But if you think about a country or a world where the best people have no conviction to act upon what they believe in, but the worst people are the ones with all the fire, it's a terrible world when the best are the weak and the worst are essentially the strong. So the second stanza of this poem describes a world where the second coming comes not from biblical times, but from the most primitive times of man. So when Yeats refers to spiritus mundi, he's referring to this concept that there is a universal spirit that also sort of houses images and knowledge of all of humanity over time. So this one is short, so I'd like to read it because I think, again, Yeats's ability to use language is immaculate. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem waiting to be born? So it's mythological in its take on how the second coming might bring forth something terrible. But it's also a reflection of the world that he's living in at the time. He wrote this in 1920, so this is just after the end of World War I. And he must have felt in many ways that the world was coming unhinged and falling apart, and the only thing that could come out of that was some rough beast that slouched toward Bethlehem waiting to be born. The last poem that I had you read by Yeats was Sailing to Byzantium. And it begins with the sentence, "That is no country for old men." So that's a phrase that's been borrowed by writers since Yeats's time. There is an author, I can't think of his name, never mind. But there's a book titled No Country for Old Men. It was then made into a movie. So obviously that's a throwback to Yeats's poem. So there are these brief but sort of backhanded mentions of old age within Sailing to Byzantium. So my favorite is old age is a tattered coat upon a stick. But yet after one has died, one ceases to be a tattered coat upon a stick. And life after death is sort of likened to this Grecian and Roman mythology and imagery. Things are beautiful and golden and young and artificial at the same time. Byzantium, I believe, is a early name for Constantinople, which became Istanbul. And so, you know, we're sailing to this beautiful, wonderful place of buildings and treasures and ruins and all these wonderful things, but it only happens to you after you die. So as you live through old age, you just are waiting it out, basically. Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own is really different from the other readings that I had you look at this during week 13. And partly this is because she took several essays that she had written for different events and then combined them into one work and then wound up expanding upon it until it was a standalone work. So there's that, but also it addresses some pretty different topics. So a lot of our topics up to this point at least in this time period, involved the war to, to some extent, because you can't pretend it wasn't happening at the time. Oh, I misspelled Virginia Woolf. Terrible. There's an L in there. So, that was motivating a lot of the poets during this time period that we're covering. But Virginia Woolf, with an L, was writing about women. And in particular, why haven't women written more fiction, more poetry? When does a woman have a room of her own where she can write and be creative? So there are a lot of sub-questions to that overarching question. One of them is just feminism in general. So up until this time, women had issues with things like literacy. Very hard to write a novel or a complex poem if you are not literate. And there were no attempts to foster literacy among women. It was viewed as not necessary. Why should a woman be literate? She needs to cook and clean and take care of children. So literacy is unimportant. A lot of women lived in poverty, either because they just were from a family that was impoverished, or their spouse basically enforced poverty upon them, in that they were not given any money of their own. They weren't taken care of. It wasn't important if they saw a physician, or if they ate well, or if they had clothes that kept them warm. Because as long as their husband was happy, that's all that mattered. Women had very few, if any, property rights, particularly within marriage. And that was something that women started to fight for at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. If a woman was married to a man who owned a home and land and so on, and they divorced, she received nothing. So no matter what the cause of the divorce was, didn't matter. She didn't get any part of the land, no money, no home, nothing. She was left with the clothes on her back, basically. So women began to fight for the right to retain property after divorce. And finally, women dealt with abuse in the home. Women were often abused. They had no recourse for, if you go to the police, they're not going to do anything. You go to the police and say, my husband beat me, and they say, well, what did you do to deserve it? So abuse was constantly a problem that there was no retribution for. And if you, grabbed a piece of firewood and killed your husband, well, then you just went to prison. It didn't matter if he was beating you or not. Woolf also points out that the words of women had been suppressed in different ways. And one of the ways that she brings up that they had been suppressed was that women were not given opportunities within the home to write. Well, why would you want to write a poem? That's not what you do. So put that piece of paper down and go do something useful. So they were repressed in the home, and even if they did manage to generate something that could maybe go to publication, they were also suppressed by publishers and people who would take things like poetry and fiction. So she makes some remarks about how World War I may have changed things for women. And part of the reason for that is the number of men who, is particularly British men, who went to war. And so now there's no longer that thumb on women at home because the husband is gone. The husband is away at war. So women now can take the opportunity to write poetry, write fiction, write whatever they like, because there's no active suppression going on in the home. And the other thing that she mentions is, why don't women write about men? And this is very true for women's writing in the 19th and early 20th century. Women wrote about women. They did not write about men, even though men do write about women. And that is a question that she raises, and I think it has to do more with acceptance. If women are barely on the edge of being accepted as authors, if you were to write about men, would men reject you or reject your work? Because how could a woman understand what it is like to be a man? But it's okay for a man to write a woman because women are simple. So women were sort of stuck in this pigeonhole about only being able to write about women's experiences. And so you see a lot of that in those, like I said, late 19th century, early 20th century writings from women, where, we've got Little Women, where we write about a family of sisters. I realize that's not English, but you've got Jane Austen. She writes, she does write about men, but it's never the man's, it's never focused on men. It's more of a situation of manners where we're focused on what the woman does. The Bronte sisters, also, men exist in the story, but they are not the primary focus of the story itself. So women were not comfortable in their ability to write about men as the main focus of their work. So she raises a lot of really interesting questions in this piece. So, it is definitely a piece, I think, that was worth pursuing, even though it was, like I said, quite different from the rest of what you read. Okay, last story I had you read for week 13 was from James Joyce, who is also from Ireland. He's from Dublin. And it's his short story called The Dead. And if you're familiar with the works of James Joyce, this comes from his short story collection called The Dubliners, and it is the very last story in the book. So Joyce is most well known for his style. It's very stream of consciousness, and you can really see that in works like Ulysses and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But I think The Dead also is fairly stream of consciousness. So at the very beginning, we have this party of almost in a way of Victorian style manners going on in Dublin society. And it moves at a rapid pace. And the reason why the pace feels so fast is because of that stream of consciousness. Things just happen without things being explained. So there's a lot of narrative and not necessarily a lot of dialogue in places, but that narrative isn't slowed down by explanations. or descriptions. It moves very quickly. So this party happens. We have Gabriel as the obvious main character. He arrives at the party. He tries to basically give money to the chambermaid, and she's not really having it. And then we go through a lot of, party of manners type behavior. Oh, isn't this wonderful? And Mr. So-and-so needs to meet Miss So-and-so, and we want to get Mr. Darcy to sing, and, things like that. And so there's a lot of that going on, but again, moving quickly. And Gabriel's not terribly engaged in this party behavior. They ask him to judge a singing contest, and he's just not into it. And he basically says all three of them win. And when he finally leaves, he leaves the party and goes home. And then we finally realize he's married. And he's married to a woman named Greta. And so he tells her about the party. And she's moved by finding out that Mr. Darcy, who apparently finally decided to sing, sang the song The Lass of Aughrim. And that's a ballad about a peasant girl who kills herself because her seducer doesn't acknowledge her pregnancy. And she's moved to tears by the mention of this song because when she was very young, and she lived with her grandmother, she knew a boy named Michael Fury who had a very lovely voice. And he used to sing that song, and they used to go on walks together, and she liked him very much. And this whole time that she's describing this moving, recollection of her younger days, he's basically wondering when she's going to shut up so that they can have sex. And then he finally figures out that, wait a minute, maybe my wife was in love with this young man who died. And Greta describes that essentially Michael Fury died for her because he went out into the rain, basically at her direction, and he caught sick and passed away. And in realizing that Greta could have loved Michael Fury, Gabriel becomes infuriated by that. And I don't mean to make a pun by saying infuriated about a character named Fury. But it makes him very angry that she could have loved someone other than him. And then she winds up basically crying herself to sleep over this memory. And so he thinks about it, the fact that a man had died for her sake is his thought. But in reality, he probably wasn't even really a man. At best, he was probably a teenager. And he's, thinking on it. Did she tell me the whole story? Is there more to the story? What was going on? And then finally, he's in tears over his wife. And then he thinks that it's love as well, because why else would a man tear up unless it was love? And so and then it just sort of fades out with this description of winter. But Joyce, who most of the time writes about what it means to be an artist, what it means to be an Irishman or a Dubliner, or so on, takes a real turn to write about this man's response to a story that was obviously so important to his wife that he never knew, which, why didn't he know? And his really sort of banal reaction to it. So it's very interesting, and that's why I asked you to consider who's alive and who's dead in this, even though, you know, Michael Fury is very obviously literally dead, but who in this story is also dead. But the book Dubliners, again, which this is a part of, is a really very interesting look at the interior workings of the minds of different characters. So if you liked The Dead, you would probably like the rest of Dubliners. Okay, so that's enough rehash of last week. Again, make sure you are getting on top of that final essay because it is due by the end of Tuesday, full stop, because some of you are seniors, so I have to have time to get all the grades in so that the seniors can have their grades in on time. So, yeah, so that's pretty much it. So on to the next thing.